The chopsticks trembled slightly in Nadia Renfrew's hand, but she set them down with a control that surprised even her. She stood at the entrance of the private tatami room at Sukakich, the restaurant her husband owned through 3 shell companies and never once brought her to, and she watched him lean toward the woman across the low table with an intimacy he had not shown her in longer than she wanted to count. Yuki Iba's laughter answered something he had said a half-second later, delicate and knowing, the laugh of a woman who understood exactly what kind of evening this was supposed to become. Nadia had come because his driver had called her by mistake, thinking she already knew where her husband was dining that night, thinking a wife would obviously be told such things. She had not been told. She had dressed carefully anyway, some instinct in her insisting she arrive looking like a woman who belonged in rooms like this, and she had walked past a hostess who did not stop her only because the hostess did not recognize the danger standing in front of her. Hiroshi Kaneda looked up first. Something crossed his face for exactly 1 second, something that might have been the ghost of shame in another man, though Nadia would later decide it had only ever been irritation at being interrupted. He did not stand. He did not reach for her. He set down his cup of tea with the same unhurried precision that governed everything he did, and he said her name the way a man says the name of a problem he has not yet finished solving. Nadia. That was all. No explanation offered.
No li attempted.
Just her name, flat and measured, as if he were testing whether the floor beneath the moment would hold his weight. She did not raise her voice. She did not throw anything. Though her hand ached faintly with an anger, she refused to give a physical shape. 26 years old, standing in a room designed to intimidate people far more powerful than her, Nadia Renfrew found that the only thing moving through her chest was a terrible, clarifying stillness, the kind of calm that arrives only after every other emotion has already burned through and left something harder behind. "Enjoy your dinner," she said. "Both of you." She turned and walked out before either of them could find a single word to offer her, her heels silent against the tatami mats, her spine straighter with every step she put between herself and the room. Yuki Iba was beautiful in the specific, curated way that made other women feel as though they had been photographed without their consent and found lacking by comparison. Dark hair cut with surgical precision, a laugh calibrated to land exactly where it would do the most damage, a way of tilting her head that suggested she had learned, somewhere along the way, that men like Hiroshi rewarded delicate deference far more than they rewarded honesty. She worked, when she worked at all, as a hostess for one of the private clubs that Hiroshi's organization quietly financed. She had been circling his orbit for nearly a year. Nadia had known about her for 4 months. Nadia had not known, until tonight, that Hiroshi had stopped bothering to keep the two halves of his life apart. She drove home through streets slick with a light rain that had begun sometime during dinner, the wipers marking a slow, steady rhythm against the windshield, and she thought, with the strange detachment of a woman observing her own life from several feet outside her body, that this was very likely the last time she would drive this particular car back to this particular house. She was not being dramatic about it. She had simply run out of reasons to keep calling this a marriage instead of what it had quietly become, an arrangement she was being written out of one candlelit dinner at a time. Hiroshi did not come home until well past midnight. Nadia was still awake, sitting in the reading chair by the bedroom window, her knees drawn up beneath the dark charcoal dress she had not bothered to change out of, watching rain collect along the black iron railing of the balcony. She heard the car in the drive, heard the quiet click of the garage door, heard his footsteps on the stairs, measured and unhurried, the way he did everything, as though the world owed him however much time he needed to arrive anywhere. He stepped into the room and stopped when he saw her sitting there. "You should have told me you were coming," he said. It was not an apology. It barely qualified as an acknowledgement. "I would have arranged things differently." "Your driver arranged it for you," Nadia said. "By accident. I don't think either of us planned for me to see exactly how differently you arrange your evenings when I'm not there to interrupt them." Something flickered behind his dark eyes, the nearest thing to discomfort she had seen cross his face in longer than she wanted to admit. Hiroshi Kaneda did not apologize easily. When he did, it was supposed to be a genuine event, something that visibly cost him, and Nadia understood, watching him now, that she had spent 3 years of marriage waiting for an event that had never once arrived and likely never would. "It is not what you believe it to be," he said. "It's exactly what I believe it to be," Nadia said. "I've known about her for 4 months, Hiroshi. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself men in your position sometimes need something uncomplicated on the side, something that doesn't ask questions about the parts of your life you keep behind locked doors. I told myself a great many things, so I could keep sitting across from you at breakfast without feeling like a fool who had married a stranger." She rose from the chair, smoothing the dress out of pure habit rather than any real concern for its condition. "Tonight you sat close enough to her that a room full of strangers could see exactly what she means to you. You didn't even bother to be careful." "Careful was never the real issue between us," Hiroshi said, and for a moment something close to honesty passed over his composed features. "You knew what kind of man you married." "I knew what you did for a living," Nadia said. "I didn't know you would stop caring whether I found out what you were doing with your heart." He did not answer that. He was a man who did not answer things he had no defense against, and the silence stretching between them was the loudest sound Nadia had ever experienced inside that house. She slid the ring from her finger. It came away easier than she expected, 3 years of marriage releasing with no more resistance than a habit finally allowed to break. She set it on the dresser between them, not thrown, not dramatic, simply placed the way a person sets down something they have decided they are finished carrying. "I'm done, Hiroshi," she said. "Whatever this was supposed to be, I'm done pretending it was ever what you promised me." Hiroshi stood beside the dresser for a long moment after she said it, staring at the ring as though sheer patience might will it back onto her hand. He was a man accustomed to problems solved with a phone call, a favor, a number quietly moved from one column of a ledger to another. Nadia's stillness offered him none of the usual levers, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Hiroshi Kaneda did not know what to do with his own hands. "You are angry," he said finally, as though naming the weather might somehow change it. "Do not decide something tonight that you will regret once the anger passes." "I have made very few decisions in this marriage," Nadia said. "Mostly I agreed with yours, and called it partnership. Tonight I made one entirely on my own, and it does not feel like a mistake. It feels like the first honest thing I have done in 3 years." She slept in the guest room that night, though sleep was a generous description for the hours she spent staring at a ceiling she had never once bothered to memorize. By 6 in the morning she had packed 2 suitcases, only the things that were genuinely hers, not the things Hiroshi had purchased to dress a life meant for other people's eyes. By 7 she had called her sister, Renee, in Chicago, who answered on the second ring with the particular alertness of a woman who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this call. "I'm coming home," Nadia said, and that was the entire explanation her sister required. By 8 that morning, before Hiroshi had even stirred in the house he had spent the night in entirely alone, Nadia was gone. Hiroshi found the ring first. He came downstairs expecting an argument, expecting tears, expecting the kind of confrontation he had learned to weather at minimal cost to himself, because in 3 years Nadia had never once actually left. She had absorbed things quietly. She had made herself smaller in every disagreement, softer in every argument, and he had come, without quite admitting it to himself, to depend on that softness the way a man depends on a door he has never bothered to lock. The ring sitting on the dresser told him plainly that the door had finally been locked and that he had not been standing on the correct side of it. He called her phone. It rang 4 times before rolling to voicemail, her voice bright and untroubled in the recording, a version of her that suddenly felt as though it belonged to someone else entirely. He called again, and again. By the 4th attempt he was standing in the doorway of a bedroom that had belonged to both of them for 3 years, understanding with a slow, sickening clarity of a man realizing a truth too late to act on quickly, that Nadia Renfrew was not going to answer. He flew to Chicago 2 days later, pride having kept him in the city 2 days longer than his instincts told him to wait, and by the time he stood outside Renee's apartment building with his hands in the pockets of a coat that cost more than most people's cars, he had rehearsed exactly nothing, because Hiroshi Kaneda did not rehearse. He arrived, and situations arranged themselves around his arrival. That was how his entire life had always worked. It did not work that way with Renee, who opened the door with a flat, unimpressed stare of a woman who had spent 2 days listening to her sister cry in the next room and had decided, somewhere in those 2 days, that she despised him with the particular efficiency of someone entirely unafraid of what he was capable of. "She doesn't want to see you," Renee said. "I would like to hear that from her directly." "You heard it the moment she took off that ring," Renee said. "Some men need someone to translate the truth for them in smaller words. I am not going to be that person for you." She closed the door before he could respond, and Hiroshi Kaneda, a man who had built an empire on knowing precisely what to say to make any locked door open, stood on a cold Chicago sidewalk with absolutely nothing to say at all. Nadia did not go back to Tokyo. She stayed with Renee for nearly a month, sleeping in the small guest room that still smelled faintly of the cedar sachets Renee kept in every closet, and in those weeks, she did something she had not allowed herself to do in 3 years of marriage. She thought carefully about what she actually wanted, without first calculating what Hiroshi would permit. She had trained as an interior architect before the marriage, skilled at reading a space and understanding exactly what it needed to feel complete, the kind of eye that noticed when a room was technically correct but emotionally empty. She had stopped taking clients 2 years into the marriage because Hiroshi preferred her available, preferred a wife who managed his houses and appearances rather than one who spent long days on job sites discussing load-bearing walls with contractors. She had told herself it was a fair exchange. Sitting in Renee's quiet kitchen in the gray Chicago mornings, she understood it had never been an exchange at all. It had been erosion, one piece of herself worn away at a time, until there was considerably less of Nadia Renfrew than there used to be. She began making calls during her second week there. An old professor from her graduate program, a woman named Priya Anand who now ran a boutique architecture firm downtown and had always respected Nadia's instincts more than she had ever said aloud, answered on the first ring and told her without hesitation that there was a position waiting whenever Nadia wanted it. Nadia wanted it starting Monday. Renee watched her sister prepare for that first day back with an expression somewhere between pride and disbelief, as though witnessing the return of a person she had assumed was permanently gone. "You look like yourself again," Renee said, handing her a cup of coffee across the kitchen table. "I mean that. I haven't seen you look like yourself in years." "I forgot what myself looked like," Nadia admitted. "I kept waiting for Hiroshi to remind me, and he never did, because I don't think he ever really knew either. He married an idea of who I could be useful as. Somewhere along the way, I let the idea replace the actual woman. So what now? Now I find out if the woman still remembers how to work," Nadia said, and there was something almost like laughter in it, thin but entirely genuine. Her first weeks at Priya's firm proved harder than she admitted out loud. Her hands had forgotten the particular rhythm of the job, the fast calculations of budgets and materials, and demanding clients who wanted the impossible delivered on modest timelines, and more than once she caught herself staring at a set of blueprints with the specific blankness of someone relearning a language she used to speak fluently. But the forgetting did not last long. By the third week she was correcting junior associates, without being asked. By the fourth she had landed a project entirely on her own, a quiet residential renovation for a couple who wanted honesty in their home instead of showiness, and staring at the plans she had drawn up herself, Nadia recognized, with something like relief, the woman who had made them. Hiroshi did not understand, at first, that his wife's departure differed from the smaller storms that had passed through their marriage before. He assumed, in the particular arrogance of a man who had rarely been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered to him, that Nadia would call within the week, that pride would eventually wear down into loneliness the way it always had before. When the week passed, and then a second week passed, he began to understand that something in the architecture of his own life had shifted in a way he had never accounted for. He was a careful man in every part of his existence except the part that involved being loved. That part he had always assumed would simply hold, the way a foundation holds a house regardless of whether anyone ever checks on it. Nadia's absence taught him, over the span of a month, that foundations required a kind of maintenance he had never once bothered to give. He tried to reach her twice more. Both times Renee answered, and both times the answer remained the same, delivered without any real heat, which somehow made it land harder than if she had screamed at him instead. "She's building something without you," Renee said the second time. You should let her finish it before you decide you want any part of it. Yuki Aiba treated Nadia's disappearance as a vacancy waiting to be filled rather than a wound deserving any respect. She began appearing at more of Hiroshi's dinners, more of his family gatherings, standing a little closer each time, staying a little later, testing the shape of a space she had already decided was hers to occupy. Hiroshi allowed it for the first several weeks out of the same inertia that governed most of his life, the simple fact that redirecting effort always cost more than allowing things to continue exactly as they already were. It was at a gathering honoring his late father's business associates, nearly 2 months after Nadia left, that Hiroshi finally understood precisely what he had traded away and exactly what he had never actually meant to trade it for. Yuki stood beside him in a room filled with men who had known his family for decades, laughing at the correct moments, touching his sleeve at careful intervals, performing the role of a woman who belonged there with a competence that should have satisfied him entirely. Instead, Hiroshi found himself watching the entrance every time it opened, waiting for a woman who was not coming, who had never been invited because inviting her would have meant publicly admitting that his marriage had genuinely ended rather than simply paused. His grandmother, Emiko Kaneda, a woman who had buried a husband and outlived several of his rivals, and had never once in her long life been afraid to say the thing everyone else was too polite to voice, found him standing alone near the garden doors. "You look like a man who has lost something he did not know he wanted until it was already gone," she said. "I have not lost anything," Hiroshi said. "Nadia is simply taking some time." "Nadia is not taking time," his grandmother said. "Nadia is building a life that no longer requires your attention to function. That is an entirely different situation, and if you possess even half the intelligence I have always credited you with, you will understand the difference before it becomes permanent." She embarrassed me in front of the staff at Tsukikage. "You embarrassed yourself," Emiko said, without softening a single syllable of it. She simply refused to pretend she had not noticed what was directly in front of her. "There is a considerable difference, Hiroshi, between a wife who forgives and a wife who has decided forgiveness is no longer something required of her. I watched your grandfather turn a wife who once laughed easily into a woman who eventually stopped laughing at anything at all. I have no interest in watching you repeat that particular history with a woman who is nothing but kind to this family in every way that ever mattered." She studied him with the patient severity of someone who intended her grandson to hear an uncomfortable truth exactly once. "You brought that girl into a restaurant you have taken your wife to on your own anniversary. You did not even select somewhere she would never hear about. That was not carelessness, Hiroshi. Some part of you wanted Nadia to know." Hiroshi did not answer, because there was no honest response that did not condemn him, and honesty had never come easily to a man who had spent his entire adult life deciding precisely which truths a room was permitted to hear. Nadia, 3 months into her new life, had leased a small apartment near the lake with money she had earned entirely on her own for the first time in 3 years, and she discovered that the earning of it mattered a great deal more than the money itself ever could. She had a desk at Priya's firm with her own name printed on a small plate, and she had a renovation project moving toward completion that reminded her, in ways she did not examine too closely, of exactly who she had been before she became Mrs. Kaneda. She had also, without entirely planning it, begun spending time with a man named Marcus Whitfield, a structural engineer who consulted regularly with Priya's firm and had asked her to lunch 3 separate times before she finally said yes on the 4th attempt. Marcus was patient in a way Hiroshi had never needed to be, because Marcus had never possessed enough power to make patience optional. He listened when she spoke. He asked thoughtful questions about her work and, more importantly, he remembered the answers. He did not seem to know, or particularly care, that her estranged husband ran an organization most of Tokyo quietly feared, and Nadia found, to her genuine surprise, that she enjoyed being a woman whose value no longer depended on knowing the right people or fearing the wrong ones. It was Marcus, in fact, standing beside her at a small architecture showcase downtown, when Hiroshi finally caught up to the entire life his wife had built without him. Hiroshi had come to the city on business he could have easily delegated, though he did not examine too closely why he had chosen to attend this particular event in person. He was standing near a scale model of a building he had no genuine interest in when he saw her across the room, and for a moment he did not recognize the woman standing there as his wife at all. Nadia stood near the model in a deep emerald dress that fit differently than anything he remembered her wearing, not because her shape had changed dramatically, though it had, some, but because she carried herself differently within it entirely. She laughed at something the man beside her said, and the laugh was not performed for anyone's benefit. It came from somewhere entirely real, somewhere Hiroshi realized, with a cold drop settling in his stomach. He had not heard from her in far longer than he wanted to admit to himself. He crossed the room before he had consciously decided to. Nadia saw him approaching and did not flinch, did not reach for Marcus's arm seeking protection, simply turned to face her husband with the same flat calm she had shown him the night she set the ring down on the dresser between them. "Hiroshi, you look well," he said, and it emerged smaller than he intended, a man who had spent his entire life commanding rooms suddenly uncertain of the size of his own voice. "I am well," Nadia said. "Marcus, this is Hiroshi." "Hiroshi, Marcus." Marcus extended his hand with the easy confidence of a man who had never once needed to fear anyone in his life, and Hiroshi shook it because the alternative, in a room full of people entirely unaware of what he was capable of, would have cost him far more than his pride was worth. "I would like to speak with you," Hiroshi said to Nadia, once Marcus had drifted, with more grace than Hiroshi expected from him, toward the refreshments. "Somewhere private." "There is nothing private left between us, Hiroshi," Nadia said. "You made certain of that at Tsukikage." "I made a mistake." "You made a choice," Nadia said. "There is a difference, and I spent 3 years letting you convince me there wasn't one." She studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, not toward forgiveness, but toward something closer to pity, the particular pity a person feels for someone who has finally arrived, uninvited and far too late, at a truth everyone else reached months earlier. "I hope you eventually find whatever it was you were searching for at that table." "I already found what I was looking for." It turns out it was never really about Yuki at all. It was about learning that I could survive perfectly well without asking her permission to. She did not raise her voice. She did not create a scene, though the moment would have entirely justified one, and Hiroshi Kaneda, who had spent his entire life believing that power meant the ability to make any room bend to his will, understood standing there that Nadia had discovered a kind of power he had never taught her and could never reclaim from her now. It was the particular power of a woman who had stopped needing him to be right in order to feel as though she had won something. He tried one final time, 2 weeks later, appearing at her firm's office with flowers that felt, even to him, like entirely the wrong gesture for the wrong offense. Nadia met him in the small lobby rather than allow him upstairs, and she did not accept the flowers. "I'm not going to keep doing this, Hiroshi," she said. "Every time you appear, I have to explain to myself all over again exactly why I left, and I am tired of explaining something I already understand completely." "I never stopped loving you," Hiroshi said, and for the first time in the entire 6 months since that dinner, it sounded like something he genuinely believed rather than something he had calculated might work. "I believe that you believe it," Nadia said, and the kindness in her voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. "But loving someone and choosing them are 2 entirely different things, Hiroshi. You love me the way a person loves a house they already own. You never thought you needed to walk through its rooms to know they still belong to you. I needed a husband who walked through the rooms. I needed one who noticed when his wife was quietly disappearing in front of him and did something about it before she was entirely gone. You never did that. Yuki was never really the reason I left. She was simply the moment I finally saw clearly what had already happened long before that dinner." She left the flowers on the lobby desk as she walked away, not out of cruelty, but out of a simple refusal to carry anything else that belonged to a version of her life she had already firmly closed the door on. Hiroshi stood in that lobby for a long time after she disappeared into the elevator, a man who commanded an empire built on fear and precision, understanding, standing alone beneath fluorescent lighting that cared nothing for who he was, that certain things simply did not answer to power at all. Certain things only answered to a kind of attention he had never learned to give, because no one had ever taken it from him before to teach him what it was actually worth. His grandmother came to see him one final time about the matter, some weeks after the showcase, and found her grandson quieter than she had known him to be in many years. "You are finally listening," Emiko said, settling into the chair across from him with the unhurried authority of a woman who had earned the right to sit anywhere she pleased. "It only took losing her to accomplish it. That is the particular tragedy of men like you and your grandfather before you. You require the loss itself before you understand the actual value of the thing. I had hoped you would be the one to learn it the easier way." "It is too late for the easier way now," Hiroshi said. "It is too late for her to return to what she left behind," his grandmother agreed. "It is not too late for you to become a man worth something to the next person foolish enough to love you. Do not waste this particular lesson simply because it arrived at such an expensive price." He did not become a different man overnight. Men like Hiroshi rarely do. But he ended things with Yuki Aiba within the month, cleanly and without the theater she seemed to expect from him, because he had finally understood that what he actually wanted was not a woman who fit conveniently into the shape of his existing world, but a wife who had once been entirely willing to build a life around him and deserved, in exchange, a man willing to notice when that life was quietly cracking beneath the weight of his neglect. Nadia, for her own part, did not wait for him to become that man. She built her life with the same deliberate care she had once reserved for other people's homes, one project, one client, one quiet Sunday morning at a time, and when she thought of Hiroshi Kaneda at all, which happened less often with each passing month, she thought of him the way a person thinks of whether they have already survived. Something that had happened to her once, powerful and frightening in its moment, and now entirely, permanently behind her. Marcus asked her, that same week, why she still kept a small box of old photographs from her marriage tucked in the back of her closet instead of simply discarding them, and Nadia sat with the question a moment before finding the honest answer. "Because I am not ashamed of who I was during that time," she said. "I was not weak for staying as long as I did. I was patient, and then I was finished, and both of those things were entirely mine to decide. I do not need to erase her to love who I am now. I only needed her to stop making every single decision for me." Marcus did not press further. He simply took her hand across the table, an easy, unremarkable gesture that asked nothing of her and offered everything in return, and Nadia understood, in that small quiet moment, precisely how far she had traveled from a woman standing frozen in a restaurant doorway. On the anniversary of the night she left the ring on the dresser, Nadia stood in her own apartment, in a deep charcoal dress not unlike the one she had worn that evening, and she studied her reflection in the window glass with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for someone else to decide her worth for her. She poured herself a glass of wine, raised it slightly toward no one in particular, and allowed herself, for the first time in a year, to simply feel glad. Word had reached Nadia, through a mutual acquaintance who meant no particular harm by sharing it, that when Hiroshi's own lawyer had finally processed the divorce paperwork, one of his associates had remarked, with the careless ease of a man who thought himself clever, that Hiroshi was now free to remarry whenever he chose. Nadia had laughed when she heard it, a genuine, surprised laugh, because the comment revealed exactly how little any of them understood what had actually happened. Freedom had never been the missing ingredient in Hiroshi's life. Attention had been the missing ingredient, and no amount of legal freedom would ever manufacture the kind of noticing he had never learned to give while it still might have mattered. She mentioned it to Marcus later that evening, expecting him to share her amusement, and he did, though he added something she had not considered. "People confuse being unmarried with being free," he said. "Being free is what you did the morning you packed those 2 suitcases. Everything since then has just been you proving it to yourself." Nadia turned the thought over quietly and found she agreed with it completely. She had been free the instant she chose herself over the comfortable, familiar shape of a life that no longer had room for the whole of who she was. Some doors, once closed, are meant to remain that way. Nadia Renfrew had learned, at considerable cost, that closing hers had been the single bravest decision of her entire life, and that the woman who had walked out of that restaurant in the rain had always been worth more than the man who let her walk away without a single word to stop her. She thought about that final image often in the months that followed, the version of herself standing in a doorway with a phone she never even needed to check, choosing calm instead of chaos, choosing her own steady footing over the temptation to demand an explanation that would never have satisfied her anyway. She had not needed Hiroshi's apology to move forward. She had only needed her own decision, made once and never revisited, that she deserved a life where noticing her was not optional. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you would have set down the ring. Like this video if Nadia earned her ending, and subscribe for more stories like hers, because there are many more women in this world learning exactly what she learned, one quiet decision at a time.